It is my pleasure to announce our next panel. Our wonderful co-directors, Loew and Wisecup, will be sharing their presentations. And it's titled Place Knowledge Keeping Archival Collaboration. So it's going to begin. So thanks.
I don't know if Elaine is still here, but I'm so grateful that you talked about Michals, because I'm going to also talk a little bit about it and talk about how it raises important questions at the intersection of archives and digital platforms. So the purpose of this panel was to be in conversation about some of the work we've been doing around collaborations on and off campus. So I'm going to talk about a collaborative project that I've been working on that's at the intersection of archives, urban Indigenous organizations, and digital platforms. And there are a couple of stakes or repercussions or lines of importance for me in this, and one has to do with building relationships between Northwestern and Indigenous organizations on campus and thinking about what those relationships look like. Another one is thinking about my own field, which is the field of English. I'm a professor in the English department here, and the ways that it and other related fields like history tend to be pretty occupied with archives as a site of knowledge, and thinking about what the stakes for those fields might be as shifting the place of knowledge and authority for those fields. So I'm going to just start by talking about the project as it began and who's involved. So it really started as I had conversations with folks at the American Indian Center about ways to support their physical archive, which is mostly composed of photographs. This is an extension with conversations I've had with Eli Susakovich over the last 4 years about archives, an extension of a project I have with my students to get them to think about Chicago in terms of Indigenous stories, presences, and art, and then also thinking I've been doing, as I said, in a kind of disciplinary context about the histories of archives and the ways that they have been involved in histories of colonialism, but also the ways that Indigenous people have remade their own archives for their own purposes. So I'm hoping to think today about how collaborative research can be in relationship with place, and how doing that can support Indigenous organizations and shift traditional conceptions of archives. So the project got started with funding from a W award from Weinberg, the College of Arts and Sciences, and eventually resulted in the proposal and funding of an NEH Common Heritage Grant. I'll talk a little bit more about NEH in a little bit. The grant was to host events where community members could view and receive a copy of photographs that were in the AIC's archives, and to build a digital platform for storing and making available those photographs. So one thing I want to emphasize is that collaboration really started around grant writing. So one of the key tasks was thinking about how to translate things that the NEH was thinking about into things that were actually useful for the American Indian Center. So sort of speaking the language of the grant, but then also making sure that that didn't end up with things that weren't actually useful for the American Indian Center. So we began by hiring some interns, and you can see them here, Naomi Harvey-Turner and Monica Boutwell. We were lucky that a group of Chicago archivists did a day of service at the American Indian Center right before the grant started, which resulted in them organizing the archives and putting them in folders. One thing I've realized as an English professor thinking about archives is that I actually don't have the experience and the knowledge necessary to organize archives as librarians do. So it was really awesome that they came in and committed a day of service to really making the archive look like an archive from a librarian's perspective. So we worked over the course of last summer with the 2 interns, and their primary work was to digitize photographs that were in the AIC's archives. We made sure that we did not make anything public that was proprietary or would have been sensitive. And a lot of their work was to think about setting up systems for keeping those materials safe. So we used a system called Locks, which if you're in libraries is probably pretty common. Lots of copies keep stuff safe. And so this involved a digital folder, a hard drive, and then multiple copies of the photographs. So the interns worked to set up those systems to make sure everything was organized online and that matched what was in the physical archive, and to make sure things stayed orderly. We then ran a couple of events. Dave Spencer at the American Indian Center had already been running a couple of events that he called Native ID, in which he brought out photographs from the archives and asked folks to identify people in those archives. So we piggybacked on some of his events by making available to folks who came a range of the photographs that were in the archive, so that they got a sense of the broader collections and a sense of the project as well. At these events, the interns also worked to scan photographs that folks brought and donated to the center so they could donate a digital copy and then take the hard copy back with them. And so the interns worked at several of those events to do that scanning and also to talk about the project. And then we concluded phase 1 of the project with an event that's a retrospective that Dave Spencer curated with some community curators, and that also involved the possibility for folks to access the digital archive through an iPad. And so you can see Monica there working with the iPad. You can also see the interface on the far right for the digital archive, which lives both on a site that's hosted by Northwestern and on the American Indian Center's website. It's so important to signal that it's really something that lives at the AIC as opposed to something that lives at Northwestern. And the website for it is there. So that's the kind of arc of the project. I want to spend a little bit of time just talking briefly about some of the questions that the project raised for me about 3 terms. Those terms are archive, digital, and collaborative. So one of the things that I really appreciated about working with the team at the American Indian Center is the ways that the project complicated what the term archive meant. So we often think about archives as similar to the building on the left. It's the American Philosophical Society. It's a super old building. It's the oldest library in North America. If you have a kind of narrow definition of libraries, including bound books. Founded in 1743 by Thomas Jefferson. We don't think about images like the one on the right, the tree and the rocks, as being places that might be archives, as being places that hold knowledge. So one of the things I loved about this project is the ways that it really pushed against the bounds of what an archive was, both in terms of where it's located and in terms of what archives do. So there's also been a sense, I think among Western scholars, that, and rightfully so, that archives are spaces that hold authoritative knowledge. And Indigenous scholars like Linda Julie Weiss-Smith have articulated the ways in which colonialism and archives have gone together, the ways in which archives hold materials and connect them to historical narratives that also then end up being authoritative histories and narratives that involve linear progressions of time and an expectation of progress, for example. So I think the AIC's archive complicates this in a couple of ways. One, it pushes us to think about archives as being located in lots of different kinds of places. But 2, it doesn't begin as a colonial archive. So there's been lots of work, and I think about Lois's work here, around decolonizing archives and making materials that have been taken from Native people and putting them back into the community. One of the things about the AIC's archive is that it complicates that notion altogether because the materials are held at the AIC, right? They were never taken from the community. And so that, I think, requires us to think again about archives, not as something that necessarily begins as a Western object or a colonial object, but something that Native organizations and people maintain and keep according to their own logics. And so I think it complicates our understandings of what archives are in important ways. The project also made me think a lot about the digital, and here I think is where the connection to Elena's paper becomes clear. So a lot of the thinking that we did around the digital through the project was about the word public. So one of the kind of promises of the digital is that it opens up who can access information, and it makes it widely accessible to a variety of publics. The NEH is very much on board with this, insofar as the grant was interested in making materials in smaller archives or repositories available to a variety of publics. One of the questions we asked a lot was, who is the public? Who should see the materials that the American Indian Center shares? Who should be the primary public that we are serving? And how might the promise of the digital to make things broadly public actually be complicated by questions about access and belonging and sharing? And so one of the things that we were able to talk through is the ways that we could be in conversation with the ways that the NEH is thinking about public, but also define who that public is a little bit more narrowly than the NEH wanted to, because they were imagining like really broad American publics. And we wanted to say, well, the first public we want to really support and think with is the public of American Indian people in Chicago. And then to kind of expand out in concentric circles from there. And then last, the project left me with a lot of questions and things that I'm continuing to think about around collaboration. One thing that Vince Romero said to me like 3 years ago now was a question about research and how it returns value to the source. The source being not Northwestern University, but the source being the unit that is outside the university, in this case the American Indian Center. So Northwestern, as many universities are, is really practiced at returning value to itself, right? whether that's through press releases or indirect costs or tenuring cases or whatever. And so one of the things I wanted to think through around this project was how do we turn value to the American Indian Center and make something like Northwestern and an NEH grant actually work outward as opposed to staying inward. And I think I will maybe just end by saying a word about the interns and the things that they taught me. So this is a list of the exhibits that they made for the retrospective. I don't know if you can read it, but my favorite one is 65 Years of Youth. Gives you a little to think about. So the interns really taught me that archives are places and they are actions and relationships. They brought their knowledge of people in the photographs, their relationships to the American Indian Center over time, their vision for the project, and their experience in curation and in cultural anthropology to the project. And so working with them and being in relationship with them really transformed the ways that I thought about an archive and about what collaboration was. The other thing that I think is an important takeaway for thinking about institutions like Northwestern and the NEH is that the American Indian Center archives don't hold knowledge that's absent from the community. So it's not feeling kind of lost in the way that the NEH might imagine that. Both the photographs and the people have knowledge. And so one of the key things that we thought about and emphasized was the process of bringing those things together. That knowledge already exists, and our goals were really about how to build processes so that people could engage with it more. And I'm just going to say thank you to a couple of people, most especially folks I haven't talked about yet, the Math Studio at Northwestern who designed the website for us, 2 people in my department who helped with the payment of everything, so really like invisible labor that made the grant possible. So Dave Kuzel and Kathy Daniels made sure that the grant funding got from Northwestern to the interns and to the American Indian Center, and none of it would have been possible without them. So I just want to emphasize that. I will end there and turn.
Okay, all right. So, I'm going to talk to you about an Indigenous tour of Northwestern. Students in my media history and I are being together with help from a Linzer grant, and we're doing this in collaboration with the Center for American and Indigenous Research, the School of Communications, Sound Arts and Industries graduate program, the Kagan Van Potawatomi and Indian Community School of Milwaukee language programs. So decades of teaching have told me that the best teaching and learning comes when you're able to integrate research, teaching, outreach, and service. And so that is my orientation as I went into this this project. When I arrived 18 months ago on this campus and read the John Evans Steering Committee report, a couple of things jumped out at me. One of them was a comment from Native students throughout the Big Ten system who said that they felt invisible. One other thing that came out of the study committee was a commitment to educate students, faculty, staff, and visitors to Northwestern about the Indigenous people of this area. And then the other one that also came out of the study committee was sort of an admonition that Northwestern needed to contribute to Northwestern's diversity initiatives. So this was sort of my thinking as I went into this project. So this is a fall class. There were 10 students in the class, and working in teams, each student researched 2 locations. We wound up with 14 viable locations. There are many others, and I envision future classes contributing to the depth and breadth of this project. We generated content within their interests. Journalist communication is scaffolding, and so there are sports journalists and arts and culture journalists and social justice and environmental justice journalists. So we first determined what each student's interest was, and I wanted to stay within their wheelhouse. And then we also wanted to stay within their media wheelhouse. Some are oriented toward print, some video, podcasting, infographics. I really wanted to get them interested in these locations and be able to bring their strengths to this. The other admonition I had was, this is a media history class, yes, but please don't think about Native people in terms of victims and of past historical artifacts. Try to find ways to pull the narrative forward. And they were able to do that in just amazing ways. So the plan is to create 2 tours. One, a virtual tour that you can access from your mobile app or from a desktop computer, and one that's an augmented reality tour. This is where the Sound Arts and Industries folks are going to help us to create soundscapes, so that as you move toward a location, you will, in the pre-encounter location, hear the voices of Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Odawa people speaking, to really give you an immersive experience. So I'm not going to talk at length about all the locations, but the first one, of course, is a land acknowledgement, pre-encounter, the Treaty of Chicago, maple tree tapping. Eli Suzukovich teaches a class, maple tree tapping and climate change. We have a wonderful slow food and garden initiative here, and it seemed to be a good place to align some food sovereignty initiatives in Indian country. Carlos Montezuma went to school here. Indian boarding schools, another good topic. We wanted to look at people, places, and historical events where there was alignment with locations on the Northwestern campus. The James Allen Center has one of the largest Inuit art collections, and by golly, if our students didn't find a contemporary comic book or graphic, or I guess you call them graphic artists, right? Not comic book artists. A graphic artist, a young Inuit woman whose grandfather is a carver. So, you know, these were the really interesting kinds of stories that students explored. There was a 1903 Carlisle football game that happened. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that one. The Menominee floor in our new basketball arena is made from Menominee lumber. Good opportunity to talk about sustainable forestry. Native Americans have the highest per capita military enlistment rate of any group in the U.S., which some people might find ironic. So this was an opportunity to explore that, because we were one of the 7 original naval ROTC locations in the country. There's some really interesting stained glass medallions in the Deering Library of Pontiac and Tecumseh and another Blackhawk. Thank you. And the Sand Creek activism, we decided not to focus on the massacre, but really on the student activism that promoted all the changes that have brought us here to this room today. And then to end sort of full circle with rights of nature, which is a really interesting concept internationally. New Zealand, for example, has granted personage to the Wanganui River, a really important resource relative to the Maori people. Ecuador has passed similar legislation. And the Ho-Chunk Nation, which is one of the ancestral tribes in this area, is contemplating that right now. So these are the kinds of things that we were exploring. So Treaty of Chicago, I want to give you an example of something you might, some media you might access when you explore this location. This is a video interview with John Loew.
Of non-native immigration just was overwhelming. It was a tsunami. And so oftentimes what the U.S. government would do is it would send out its trade negotiators to notify the tribes that a treaty was going to be had. They would notify the leaders of the tribes if they could find them, and they would say, well, we need to meet in 3 days. So for instance, the Treaty of Chicago 1833, they would come and they would say, well, in September we're going to meet, and you're going to cede the last of your land, and we're going to give you certain things for that. If the Indians responded with, no, we're not interested, they usually got the same answer, which was, we don't care whether you're interested or not. We're going to have treaty negotiations. This is your opportunity to negotiate your best deal or take nothing at all, because you're all going to be removed.
So you may access the historical document of the Treaty of Chicago. You may see some kind of creative expression, and you may access a video at that particular location. The Northwestern, not all of it is heavy. At this location, in 1903, Northwestern played the Carlisle Indian Boarding School, lost terribly. There were 3 Mohican Indians from Wisconsin who were playing on the Carlisle team. They liked the campus enough, they transferred to Northwestern and began playing football for Northwestern the next year. One of them went on to become the first American Indian dentist, graduated from our erstwhile dental school. The other became a judge, the first Indian judge in the state of Washington, and became the mayor of Aberdeen, Washington. So kind of interesting, and the Mohicans in Wisconsin were thrilled to learn about the history of these 2 interesting tribal members. And so there was a lot of, my students were sharing with them, they're sharing with us. The students are doing X's and O's and animated flip cards. So when you go to the site, you'll see, and I'm sorry I couldn't get it to work in PowerPoint, but when you go to the site, you'll see 3 sort of old-timey trading cards. So you see the pictures on the front, and if you hover your cursor or click on the photo, it'll flip, and instead of seeing, you know, the height, the weight, and the position they played, you'll see their tribal affiliation and some of the interesting things they did in their life. Really brilliant, along with animated X's and O's of the hidden ball trick, which was used in that game. Just kind of really interesting kind of stuff. Maple tree tapping, Eli, I mentioned, runs this, offers this class during the fall, and students took beautiful photos. They investigated sort of the traditional fur trade significance of maple tapping, and then I wanted to share this video, this 1-minute video essay that one of our students did.
I didn't think when I came to college that I'd learn to make maple syrup using sap from trees on campus, but that's what I did this quarter in my class called Maple Syrup and Climate Change. We had to filter the sap before cooking it. You could use cheesecloth, but all we had on hand was a t-shirt. We had so much sap, many buckets full, and even more that had been stored and frozen in gallon-sized Ziploc bags. The sap should reach 7 degrees above the boiling point of water, 219 degrees Fahrenheit. You wait until all the excess water is boiled away, and then finally, you have a darker, thicker liquid. It starts to boil a lot. As soon as it hits 219 degrees, you have to remove it from the heat. Otherwise, it will turn into maple sugar and can burn. We stored our syrup in 3 mason jars. Then, we ate it with small waffles, but since I've brought my whole jar of maple syrup into the dining hall. It took 10 hours, but I definitely do it again. It's just really neat to have this product that we made from the trees. It's much more intimate than maple syrup bought at the store.
So again, a way to sort of pull some of these concepts forward and not present Native people or their activities strictly as artifacts of the past.
I did.
One of the locations is the Sand Creek student activism. Their students created a timeline beginning with the Sand Creek Massacre, but then looking at the activism that began in about 2013-14. And there are a number of people who are interviewed, including several who are in this room right now, talking about various facets of that student activism. And so when you go to that site, you'll also see a link to a Northwestern produced video. And the Welsh Ryan basketball floor arena. There's a link to a video here. I'm going to move forward through that because of time. And I think I'll stop there to make sure that we're on track. But our plan is to continue to contribute to the tour. We hope to have our first version of it available on Indigenous Peoples Day. We're going to unveil it. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you take the tour when it's finished. Are there any questions?
Not a question, but a comment. Newberry Library received several boxes of pictures by a man named Kaban Band, who's Japanese. He's married to one of our UIC secretaries. He just dropped them off, no information, nothing. And the previous director had me go through and identify as many people as I could. But she left before she could get a group in, which is what is really needed to identify, because there are no identifications on there. But it's a rich source, and it's just sitting there. So your project would be ideal out there.
And I also wanted to give a shout out to Lauren Yoyomi. I'm Lauren 2.0. Lauren was teaching a lot of the Native-related courses in the Medill School of Journalism and co-chaired that John Evans Steering Committee. But he had his classes collect oral interviews of urban Indians in Chicago for many, many years. And I'm thinking that's a really rich source of material that might be able to go into the tour I'm working on, and I know you're working on a Chicago Indigenous tour. And I mention that only because he also gave the Newberry a copy and the American Indian Center a copy.
Now, NACE had done interviews, but you have those.
I just have you both speak to some of the guiding principles behind the initiatives that you're working on right now. And I know some of these principles are maybe more longer standing, but yeah. And I guess maybe just like the interaction between like the academic sort of principles sometimes, but then the engagement, the community involvement.
Yeah. I'm happy to start. Maybe be in conversation. I mean, I think. So thinking about where benefit ends up, right, and where focus is, I think a lot about, as we build CNAIR, about the ways that we're doing it within the university that's very practiced at working in certain kinds of ways, right? And that often means that it makes it seem common sense to put certain people in spotlights and not others, right? Or for funding to flow in one way or not the other, or for some things to be called research and not others, right? And so I think part of what, for me, was really important about the project, and what I'm still thinking through and that the project taught me, is how to be in that space, but try to shift the processes and the structures that are really practiced at moving in those ways, right? Collaboration, I think I've learned a lot from you on this, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that too. Collaboration seems like a key way to do that, even as, and here I think about the NEH and the way it's encouraging collaboration. I think collaboration on its own doesn't necessarily mean like better, or that it's shifting the focus of research, or it's shifting who gets the benefit, right? So I think there's always, I'm constantly reminding myself to make sure I think through that, right? And not to take collaboration as a kind of good in and of itself. Because I think that, like, as a non-native person, if I'm like, oh, I'm collaborating, then that sometimes can redound back on me as like, the collaborator you are, and I don't want that to happen. What would you say?
I am acutely aware that I have this wonderful opportunity in this place of privilege. I mean, that we are in a university that has tremendous resources. It's very exclusive, and it just oozes privilege. And I think that with that privilege comes an obligation to be of service to communities that are that privileged. And so And I think if we do that with a certain kind of cultural humility, I think we play a really important role, and I think it's a role we can all feel really good about and not embarrassed, that we have this privilege. But I think the key is to become the kind of institution that Native American families and organizations and governments and communities trust with their children, with their ideas. So we have a lot of work that we need to do on us. And I think the first, and having said that, I'll also say that Kelly and Jennifer and Pam and I have had some goals that we set for ourselves. And we thought we would, we hoped to be at a certain point by year 3. We're already hitting a lot of those goals already, 18 months in. And I think it's because we went about it in a good way. We focused on relationship building. We didn't just leap into research. We focused on relationship building. And it was important, Kelly worked a lot on creating structures and affiliations within Northwestern and throughout the academic world of university world. Pam focused on using her her connections to national Native organizations. Jennifer has strong kinship relationships with urban Indians here in Chicago, and I bring connections to tribal communities in the Great Lakes region. That's kind of where we started, and they were puzzle pieces that all fit together, and I think that's why, it just, seeing so many people in the room, I mean, there really is something positive happening, and I'm getting that when I the fact that I was invited to a tribal summit last week. Word is getting out, and that's really exciting. But it also, we have to be really careful about how we move forward, that we don't move too fast. So I think that's a principle, and to always remind ourselves that we need humility, because we don't know everything out there, and we don't know what tribal communities need. They need to tell us what they need, and we need to listen and be respectful and use those 4 R's.